Wikipedia is a multilingual free online encyclopedia written and maintained by a community of volunteers through open collaboration and a wiki-based editing system. Its editors are known as Wikipedians. Wikipedia is the largest and most read reference work in history. It is consistently one of the 10 most popular websites ranked by SimilarWeb and formerly Alexa. As of 2022, Wikipedia was ranked the 7th most popular site. It is hosted by the Wikimedia Foundation, an American non-profit organization funded mainly through donations. On January 15, 2001, Jimmy Wales and Larry Sanger launched Wikipedia. Sanger coined its name as a blend of wiki and encyclopedia. Wales was influenced by the spontaneous order ideas associated with Friedrich Hayek and the Austrian School of Economics after being exposed to these ideas by Austrian economist and Mises Institute senior fellow Mark Thornton. Initially available only in English, versions in other languages were quickly developed. Its combined editions comprise more than 59 million articles, attracting around 2 billion unique device visits per month and more than 17 million edits per month as of November 2020. In 2006, Time magazine stated that the policy of allowing anyone to edit had made Wikipedia the biggest encyclopedia in the world. Wikipedia has received praise for its enablement of the democratization of knowledge, extent of coverage, unique structure, culture, and reduced degree of commercial bias, but criticism for exhibiting systemic bias, particularly gender bias against women and alleged ideological bias. The reliability of Wikipedia was frequently criticized in the 2000s, but has improved over time, as Wikipedia has been generally praised in the late 2010s and early 2020s. The website's coverage of controversial topics such as American politics and major events like the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has received substantial media attention. It has been censored by world governments, ranging from specific pages to the entire site. In April 2018, Facebook and YouTube announced that they would help users detect fake news by suggesting fact-checking links to related Wikipedia articles. Articles on breaking news are often accessed as a source of frequently updated information about those events. History. Origins. After the First World War, but particularly with Second World War, internationalism was gaining, with the creation of the Bretton Woods system in 1944, the United Nations in 1945 and the French Union, the latter directing decolonization by possibly integrating its colonies into a European community. In this light, European integration was seen, already during the war, as an antidote to the extreme nationalism which had devastated parts of the continent. The Ventotene Prison Manifesto of 1941 by Altiero Spinelli propagated European integration through the Italian resistance and after 1943 through the European Federalist movement. Winston Churchill called in 1943 for a post-war Council of Europe, and on September 19, 1946, at the University of Zurich, coincidentally parallel to the Hertenstein Congress of the Union of European Federalists, for a United States of Europe. Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi, who successfully established during the interwar period the oldest organization for European integration, the Pan-European Union, founded in June 1947 the European Parliamentary Union. Towards the end of World War II, the three Allied powers discussed during the Tehran Conference and the ensuing 1943 Moscow Conference the plans to establish joint institutions. This led to a decision at the Yalta Conference in 1944 to include Free France as the fourth Allied power and to form a European Advisory Commission, later replaced by the Council of Foreign Ministers and the Allied Control Council, following the German surrender and the Potsdam Agreement in 1945. The growing rift among the four powers became evident as a result of the rigged 1947 Polish legislative election, which constituted an open breach of the Yalta Agreement, followed by the announcement of the Truman Doctrine on March 12, 1947. On March 4, 1947, France and the United Kingdom signed the Treaty of Dunkirk for mutual assistance in the event of future military aggression in the aftermath of World War II against any of the pair. The rationale for the treaty was the threat of a potential future military attack, specifically a Soviet one in practice, though publicized under the disguise of a German one, according to the official statements. Immediately following the February 1948 coup d'état by the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, the London Six-Power Conference was held, resulting in the Soviet boycott of the Allied Control Council and its incapacitation, an event marking the beginning of the Cold War. The remainder of the year 1948 marked the beginning of the institutionalized modern European integration. Initial years and the Paris Treaty. None. Treaty of Rome. None. First Enlargement, and European Cooperation. None. Treaties of Maastricht, Amsterdam, and Nice. None. Treaty of Lisbon, and Brexit. None. Timeline. Since the end of World War II, sovereign European countries have entered into treaties and thereby cooperated and harmonized policies in an increasing number of areas, in the European integration project or the construction of Europe. The following timeline outlines the legal inception of the European Union, the principal framework for this unification. The EU inherited many of its present responsibilities from the European communities, which were founded in the 1950s in the spirit of the Schuman Declaration. Politics. The European Union operates through a hybrid system of supranational and intergovernmental decision-making, and according to the principles of conferral and of subsidiarity. Laws made by the EU institutions are passed in a variety of forms. Generally speaking, they can be classified into two groups: those which come into force without the necessity for national implementation measures and those which specifically require national implementation measures. EU policy is in general promulgated by EU directives, which are then implemented in the domestic legislation of its member states, and EU regulations, which are immediately enforceable in all member states. Lobbying at EU level by special interest groups is regulated to try to balance the aspirations of private initiatives with public interest decision-making process. Budget. The European Union had an agreed budget of €120.7 billion for the year 2007 and €864.3 billion for the period 2007-2013. Representing 1.10% and 1.05% of the EU 27's GNI forecast for the respective periods. In 1960, the budget of the European Community was 0.03% of GDP. In the 2010 budget of €141.5 billion, the largest single expenditure item was cohesion and competitiveness with around 45% of the total budget. Next was agriculture with approximately 31% of the total. Rural development, environment, and fisheries takes up around 11%. Administration accounts for around 6%. The EU as a global partner in citizenship, freedom, security, and justice had approximately 6% and 1% respectively. In November 2020, two members of the Union, Hungary and Poland, blocked approval to the EU's budget at a meeting in the Committee of Permanent Representatives, citing a proposal that linked funding with adherence to the rule of law. The budget included a COVID-19 recovery fund of €750 billion. The budget may still be approved if Hungary and Poland withdraw their vetoes after further negotiations in the Council and the European Council. Bodies combating fraud have also been established, including the European Anti-Fraud Office and the European Public Prosecutor's Office. The latter is a decentralized independent body of the European Union, established under the Treaty of Lisbon between 22 of the 27 states of the EU following the method of enhanced cooperation. The European Public Prosecutor's Office investigate and prosecute fraud against the budget of the European Union and other crimes against the EU's financial interests, including fraud concerning EU funds of over €10,000 and cross-border VAT fraud cases involving damages above €10 million. Governance. Member states retain in principle all powers not conferred by them on the European Union, though the exact delimitation has on many occasions become a subject of scholarly or legal disputes. Inspired by the famous Commerce Clause and the huge impact that its interpretation and mode of application by the Supreme Court of the United States had on shaping the American federal government, the Court of Justice of the European Union has sometimes managed to expand through its case law the powers of the EU, including those related to areas other than only the ones explicitly conferred on it in the founding treaties. In certain fields the EU has been awarded exclusive competence and mandate. These are areas in which member states have entirely renounced their own capacity to enact legislation. In other areas the EU and its member states share the competence to legislate. While both can legislate, the member states can only legislate to the extent to which the EU has not. In other policy areas the EU can only coordinate, support and supplement member state action but cannot enact legislation with the aim of harmonizing national laws. That a particular policy area falls into a certain category of competence is not necessarily indicative of what legislative procedure is used for enacting legislation within that policy area. Different legislative procedures are used within the same category of competence, and even with the same policy area. The distribution of competences in various policy areas between member states and the Union is divided in the following three categories. The European Union has 7 principal decision-making bodies, its institutions: the European Parliament, the European Council, the Council of the European Union, the European Commission, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Central Bank and the European Court of Auditors. Competence in scrutinizing and amending legislation is shared between the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament, while executive tasks are performed by the European Commission and in a limited capacity by the European Council. The monetary policy of the Eurozone is determined by the European Central Bank. The interpretation and the application of EU law and the treaties are ensured by the Court of Justice of the European Union. The EU budget is scrutinized by the European Court of Auditors. There are also a number of ancillary bodies which advise the EU or operate in a specific area. Branches of power: Executive branch, Legislative branch, Judicial branch. Additional branches. Law. Constitutionally, the EU bears some resemblance to both a confederation and a federation, but has not formally defined itself as either. It is more integrated than a traditional confederation of states because the general level of government widely employs qualified majority voting in some decision-making among the member states, rather than relying exclusively on unanimity. It is less integrated than a federal state because it is not a state in its own right. Sovereignty continues to flow from the bottom up, from the several peoples of the separate member states, rather than from a single undifferentiated whole. This is reflected in the fact that the member states remain the masters of the treaties, retaining control over the allocation of competences to the Union through constitutional change, in that they retain control of the use of armed force, they retain control of taxation, and in that they retain a right of unilateral withdrawal under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. In addition, the principle of subsidiarity requires that only those matters that need to be determined collectively are so determined. Under the principle of supremacy, national courts are required to enforce the treaties that their member states have ratified, even if doing so requires them to ignore conflicting national law, and even constitutional provisions. The direct effect and supremacy doctrines were not explicitly set out in the European treaties but were developed by the Court of Justice itself over the 1960s, apparently under the influence of its then most influential judge, Frenchman Robert Lacourt. The question whether the secondary law enacted by the EU has a comparable status in relation to national legislation, has been a matter of debate among legal scholars. Primary law. Secondary law. Foreign relations. Foreign policy cooperation between member states dates from the establishment of the Community in 1957, when member states negotiated as a bloc in international trade negotiations under the EU's common commercial policy. Steps for a more wide-ranging coordination in foreign relations began in 1970 with the establishment of European political cooperation, which created an informal consultation process between member states with the aim of forming common foreign policies. In 1987 the European political cooperation was introduced on a formal basis by the Single European Act. EPC was renamed as the Common Foreign and Security Policy by the Maastricht Treaty. The aims of the CFSP are to promote both the EU's own interests and those of the international community as a whole, including the furtherance of international cooperation, respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The CFSP requires unanimity among the member states on the appropriate policy to follow on any particular issue. The unanimity and difficult issues treated under the CFSP sometimes lead to disagreements, such as those which occurred over the war in Iraq. The coordinator and representative of the CFSP within the EU is the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, who speaks on behalf of the EU in foreign policy and defense matters, and has the task of articulating the positions expressed by the member states on these fields of policy into a common alignment. The High Representative heads up the European External Action Service, a unique EU department that has been officially implemented and operational since December 1, 2010 on the occasion of the first anniversary of the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon. The EEAS will serve as a foreign ministry and diplomatic corps for the European Union. Besides the emerging international policy of the European Union, the international influence of the EU is also felt through enlargement. The perceived benefits of becoming a member of the EU act as an incentive for both political and economic reform in states wishing to fulfill the EU's accession criteria, and are considered an important factor contributing to the reform of European formerly communist countries. 762 This influence on the internal affairs of other countries is generally referred to as soft power, as opposed to military hard power. Defense. The predecessors of the European Union were not devised as a military alliance because NATO was largely seen as appropriate and sufficient for defense purposes. 21 EU members are members of NATO while the remaining member states follow policies of neutrality. The Western European Union, a military alliance with a mutual defense clause, was disbanded in 2010 as its role had been transferred to the EU. Following the Kosovo War in 1999, the European Council agreed that the Union must have the capacity for autonomous action, backed by credible military forces, the means to decide to use them, and the readiness to do so, in order to respond to international crises without prejudice to actions by NATO. To that end, a number of efforts were made to increase the EU's military capability, notably the Helsinki Headline Goal process. After much discussion, the most concrete result was the EU Battle Groups initiative, each of which is planned to be able to deploy quickly about 1,500 personnel. Since the withdrawal of the United Kingdom, France is the only member officially recognized as a nuclear weapon state and the sole holder of a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. France and Italy are also the only EU countries that have power projection capabilities outside of Europe. Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium participate in NATO nuclear sharing. Most EU member states opposed the nuclear weapon ban treaty. EU forces have been deployed on peacekeeping missions from Middle and Northern Africa to the Western Balkans and Western Asia. EU military operations are supported by a number of bodies, including the European Defence Agency, European Union Satellite Centre and the European Union Military Staff. The European Union military staff is the highest military institution of the European Union, established within the framework of the European Council, and follows on from the decisions of the Helsinki European Council, which called for the establishment of permanent political military institutions. The European Union military staff is under the authority of the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and the Political and Security Committee. It directs all military activities in the EU context, including planning and conducting military missions and operations in the framework of the Common Security and Defence Policy and the development of military capabilities, and provides the Political and Security Committee with military advice and recommendations on military issues. In an EU consisting of 27 members, substantial security and defence cooperation is increasingly relying on collaboration among all member states. The European Border and Coast Guard Agency is an agency of the EU aiming to detect and stop illegal immigration, human trafficking and terrorist infiltration, having since 2015 a stronger role and mandate along with national authorities for border management. The EU also operates the European Travel Information and Authorization System, the Entry/Exit System, the Schengen Information System, the Visa Information System and the Common European Asylum System, which provide common databases for police and immigration authorities. The impetus for the development of this cooperation was the advent of open borders in the Schengen area and the associated cross-border crime. Member States. Through successive enlargements, the European Union has grown from the 6 founding states to 27 members. Countries accede to the Union by becoming party to the founding treaties, thereby subjecting themselves to the privileges and obligations of EU membership. This entails a partial delegation of sovereignty to the institutions in return for representation within those institutions, a practice often referred to as pooling of sovereignty. In some policies, there are several member states that ally with strategic partners within the Union. Examples of such alliances include the Baltic Assembly, the Benelux Union, the Bucharest Nine, the Craiova Group, the EU Med Group, the Lublin Triangle, the New Hanseatic League, the Three Seas Initiative, the Visegrad Group, and the Weimar Triangle. Several overseas territories and dependencies of various member states are also formally part of the EU. To become a member, a country must meet the Copenhagen criteria, defined at the 1993 meeting of the European Council in Copenhagen. These require a stable democracy that respects human rights and the rule of law, a functioning market economy, and the acceptance of the obligations of membership, including EU law. Evaluation of a country's fulfillment of the criteria is the responsibility of the European Council. The 4 countries forming the European Free Trade Association are not EU members, but have partly committed to the EU's economy and regulations: Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, which are a part of the single market through the European Economic Area, and Switzerland, which has similar ties through bilateral treaties. The relationships of the European microstates, Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, and Vatican City include the use of the euro and other areas of cooperation. Subdivisions. Subdivisions of member states are based on the nomenclature of territorial units for statistics, a geocode standard for statistical purposes. The standard, adopted in 2003, is developed and regulated by the European Union, and thus only covers the member states of the EU in detail. The nomenclature of territorial units for statistics is instrumental in the European Union's structural funds and cohesion fund delivery mechanisms and for locating the area where goods and services subject to European public procurement legislation are to be delivered. Schengen area. The Schengen area is an area comprising 26 European countries that have officially abolished all passport and all other types of border control at their mutual borders. Being an element within the wider area of freedom, security, and justice policy of the EU, it mostly functions as a single jurisdiction under a common visa policy for international travel purposes. The area is named after the 1985 Schengen Agreement and the 1990 Schengen Convention, both signed in Schengen, Luxembourg. Of the 27 EU member states, 22 participate in the Schengen area. Of the 5 EU members that are not part of the Schengen area, 4 Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, and Romania are legally obligated to join the area in the future. Ireland maintains an opt-out, and instead operates its own visa policy. The 4 European Free Trade Association member states, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland, are not members of the EU, but have signed agreements in association with the Schengen Agreement. Also, 3 European microstates Monaco, San Marino, and the Vatican City maintain open borders for passenger traffic with their neighbors, and are therefore considered de facto members of the Schengen area due to the practical impossibility of traveling to or from them without transiting through at least one Schengen member country. Candidate countries. There are 7 countries that are recognized as candidates for membership: Albania, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, Turkey, and Ukraine. Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland have submitted membership applications in the past, but subsequently frozen or withdrawn them. Additionally, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Kosovo are officially recognized as potential candidates, with Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia having submitted membership applications. Former members. Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty provides the basis for a member to leave the EU. 2 territories have left the Union. Greenland withdrew in 1985. The United Kingdom formally invoked Article 50 of the Consolidated Treaty on European Union in 2017, and became the only sovereign state to leave when it withdrew from the EU in 2020. Geography. The EU's member states cover an area of 4,233,262 square kilometers. The EU's highest peak is Mont Blanc in the Grayan Alps, 4,810.45 meters above sea level. The lowest points in the EU are Lammerfjorden, Denmark, and Zuidplaspolder, Netherlands, at 7 m below sea level. The landscape, climate, and economy of the EU are influenced by its coastline, which is 65,993 kilometers long. Including the overseas territories of France which are located outside the continent of Europe, but which are members of the Union, the EU experiences most types of climate from Arctic to tropical, rendering meteorological averages for the EU as a whole meaningless. The majority of the population lives in areas with a temperate maritime climate, a Mediterranean climate, or a warm summer continental or hemiboreal climate. Climate. The climate of the European Union is of a temperate, continental nature, with the maritime climate prevailing on the western coasts and a Mediterranean climate in the south. The climate is strongly conditioned by the Gulf Stream, which warms the western region to levels unattainable at similar latitudes on other continents. Western Europe is oceanic, while Eastern Europe is continental and dry. 4 seasons occur in Western Europe, while Southern Europe experiences a wet season and a dry season. Southern Europe is hot and dry during the summer months. The heaviest precipitation occurs downwind of water bodies due to the prevailing westerlies, with higher amounts also seen in the Alps. Tornadoes occur within Europe, but tend to be weak. The Netherlands experiences a disproportionately high number of tornadic events. Environment. In 1957, when the European Economic Community was founded, it had no environmental policy. Over the past 50 years, an increasingly dense network of legislation has been created, extending to all areas of environmental protection, including air pollution, water quality, waste management, nature conservation, and the control of chemicals, industrial hazards, and biotechnology. According to the Institute for European Environmental Policy, environmental law comprises over 500 directives, regulations, and decisions, making environmental policy a core area of European politics. European policymakers originally increased the EU's capacity to act on environmental issues by defining it as a trade problem. Trade barriers and competitive distortions in the common market could emerge due to the different environmental standards in each member state. In subsequent years, the environment became a formal policy area, with its own policy actors, principles, and procedures. The legal basis for EU environmental policy was established with the introduction of the Single European Act in 1987. Initially, EU environmental policy focused on Europe. More recently, the EU has demonstrated leadership in global environmental governance, e.g. the role of the EU in securing the ratification and coming into force of the Kyoto Protocol despite opposition from the United States. This international dimension is reflected in the EU's sixth Environmental Action Programme, which recognizes that its objectives can only be achieved if key international agreements are actively supported and properly implemented both at EU level and worldwide. The Lisbon Treaty further strengthened the leadership ambitions. EU law has played a significant role in improving habitat and species protection in Europe, as well as contributing to improvements in air and water quality and waste management. Mitigating climate change is one of the top priorities of EU environmental policy. In 2007, member states agreed that, in the future, 20% of the energy used across the EU must be renewable, and carbon dioxide emissions have to be lower in 2020 by at least 20% compared to 1990 levels. In 2017, the EU emitted 9.1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The European Union claims that already in 2018, its GHG emissions were 23% lower than in 1990. The EU has adopted an emissions trading system to incorporate carbon emissions into the economy. The European Green Capital is an annual award given to cities that focuses on the environment, energy efficiency, and quality of life in urban areas to create smart city. In the 2019 elections to the European Parliament, the Green parties increased their power, possibly because of the rise of post-materialist values. Proposals to reach a zero-carbon economy in the European Union by 2050 were suggested in 2018-2019. Almost all member states supported that goal at an EU summit in June 2019. The Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, and Poland disagreed. In June 2021, the European Union passed a European climate law with targets of 55% GHG emissions reduction by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. In 2021, the European Union and the United States pledged to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. The pledge is considered as a big achievement for climate change mitigation. Economy. EU member states own the estimated third largest after the United States and China net wealth in the world, equal to around 1/6 of the $464 trillion global wealth. Of the top 500 largest corporations in the world measured by revenue in 2010, 161 had their headquarters in the EU. In 2016, unemployment in the EU stood at 8.9% while inflation was at 2.2%, and the account balance at 0.9% of GDP. The average annual net earnings in the European Union was around €25,000 in 2021. There is a significant variation in nominal GDP per capita within individual EU states. The difference between the richest and poorest regions ranged, in 2017, from 31% of the EU to 8 average to 253% or from €4,600 to €92,600. Economic and Monetary Union. The creation of a European single currency became an official objective of the European Economic Community in 1969. In 1992, having negotiated the structure and procedures of a currency union, the member states signed the Maastricht Treaty and were legally bound to fulfill the agreed-on rules, including the convergence criteria, if they wanted to join the monetary union. The states wanting to participate had first to join the European exchange rate mechanism. To prevent the joining states from getting into financial trouble or crisis after entering the monetary union, they were obliged in the Maastricht Treaty to fulfill important financial obligations and procedures, especially to show budgetary discipline and a high degree of sustainable economic convergence, as well as to avoid excessive government deficits and limit the government debt to a sustainable level, as agreed in the European Fiscal Pact. Capital Markets Union and Financial Institutions. Eurozone and Banking Union. Trade. As a political entity, the European Union is represented in the World Trade Organization. Two of the original core objectives of the European Economic Community were the development of a common market, subsequently becoming a single market, and a customs union between its member states. Single market. Customs union. External trade. Competition and consumer protection. The EU operates a competition policy intended to ensure undistorted competition within the single market. In 2001, the Commission for the first time prevented a merger between two companies based in the United States which had already been approved by their national authority. Another high-profile case, against Microsoft, resulted in the Commission fining Microsoft over €777 million following 9 years of legal action. Energy. In 2006, the EU 27 had a gross inland energy consumption of 1,825 million tons of oil equivalent. Around 46% of the energy consumed was produced within the member states while 54% was imported. In these statistics, nuclear energy is treated as primary energy produced in the EU, regardless of the source of the uranium, of which less than 3% is produced in Indiana. The EU has had legislative power in the area of energy policy for most of its existence. This has its roots in the original European coal and steel community. The introduction of a mandatory and comprehensive European energy policy was approved at the meeting of the European Council in October 2005, and the first draft policy was published in January 2007. The EU has 5 key points in its energy policy: increase competition in the internal market, encourage investment and boost interconnections between electricity grids, diversify energy resources with better systems to respond to a crisis, establish a new treaty framework for energy cooperation with Russia while improving relations with energy-rich states in Central Asia and North Africa, use existing energy supplies more efficiently while increasing renewable energy commercialization, and finally increase funding for new energy technologies. In 2007, EU countries as a whole imported 82% of their oil, 57% of their natural gas and 97.48% of their uranium demands. The 3 largest suppliers of natural gas to the European Union are Russia, Norway, and Algeria, that amounted for about 3/4 of the imports in 2019. There is a strong dependence on Russian energy that the EU has been attempting to reduce. However, in May 2022, it was reported that the European Union is preparing another sanction against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. It is expected to target Russian oil, Russian and Belarusian banks, as well as individuals and companies. According to an article by Reuters, 2 diplomats stated that the European Union may impose a ban on imports of Russian oil by the end of 2022. In May 2022, the EU Commission published the REPowerEU initiative, a €300 billion plan outlining the path towards the end of EU dependence on Russian fossil fuels by 2030 and the acceleration on the clean energy transition. Transport. The European Union manages cross-border road, railway, airport, and water infrastructure through the Trans-European Transport Network, created in 1990, and the Trans-European Combined Transport Network. TENT comprises two network layers, the core network, which is to be completed by 2030, and the comprehensive network, which is to be completed by 2050. The network is currently made up of 9 core corridors: the Baltic-Adriatic Corridor, the North Sea-Baltic Corridor, the Mediterranean Corridor, the Orient/East Med Corridor, the Scandinavian-Mediterranean Corridor, the Rhine-Alpine Corridor, the Atlantic Corridor, the North Sea-Mediterranean Corridor, and the Rhine-Danube Corridor. Road transportation was organized under the TENT by the Trans-European Road Network. Bundesautobahn 7 is the longest national motorway in the EU at 963 kilometers. Maritime transportation is organized under the TENT by the Trans-European Inland Waterway Network, and the Trans-European Seaport Network. European seaports are categorized as international, community, or regional. The Port of Rotterdam is the busiest in the EU, and the world's largest seaport outside of East Asia, located in and near the city of Rotterdam, in the province of South Holland in the Netherlands. The European Maritime Safety Agency, founded in 2002 in Lisbon, Portugal, is charged with reducing the risk of maritime accidents, marine pollution from ships and the loss of human lives at sea by helping to enforce the pertinent EU legislation. Air transportation is organized under the TENT by the Trans-European Airport Network. European airports are categorized as international, community, or regional. The Charles de Gaulle Airport is the busiest in the EU, located in and near the city of Paris, in France. The European Common Aviation Area is a single market in aviation. ECAA agreements were signed on May 5, 2006 in Salzburg, Austria between the EU and some third countries. The ECAA liberalizes the air transport industry by allowing any company from any ECAA member state to fly between any ECAA member states' airports, thereby allowing a foreign airline to provide domestic flights. The Single European Sky is an initiative that seeks to reform the European air traffic management system through a series of actions carried out in 4 different levels with the aim of satisfying the needs of the European airspace in terms of capacity, safety, efficiency, and environmental impact. Civil aviation safety is under the responsibility of the European Union Aviation Safety Agency. It carries out certification, regulation, and standardization and also performs investigation and monitoring. The idea of a European-level aviation safety authority goes back to 1996, but the agency was only legally established in 2002, and began operating in 2003. Rail transportation is organized under the TENT by the Trans-European Rail Network, made up of the high-speed rail network and the conventional rail network. The Gare du Nord railway station is the busiest in the EU, located in and near the city of Paris, in France. Rail transport in Europe is being synchronized with the European Rail Traffic Management System with the goal of greatly enhancing safety, increase efficiency of train transports and enhance cross-border interoperability. This is done by replacing former national signaling equipment and operational procedures with a single new Europe-wide standard for train control and command systems. This system is conducted by the European Union Agency for Railways. Telecommunications and space. Mobile communication roaming charges are abolished throughout the EU, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. The European Union Agency for the Space Programme, headquartered in Prague, Czech Republic, was established in 2021 to manage the European Union space program in order to implement the pre-existing European space policy, established on May 22, 2007 between the EU and the European Space Agency, known collectively as the European Space Council. This was the first common political framework for space activities established by the EU. Each member state has pursued to some extent their own national space policy, though often coordinating through the ESA. Günter Verheugen, the European Commissioner for Enterprise and Industry, has stated that even though the EU is a world leader in the technology, it is being put on the defensive by the United States and Russia, and that it only has about a 10-year technological advantage on China and India, which are racing to catch up. Galileo is a global navigation satellite system that went live in 2016, created by the EU through the ESA, operated by the USPA, with 2 ground operations centers in Fusino, Italy, and Oberpfaffenhofen, Germany. The €10 billion project is named after the Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei. One of the aims of Galileo is to provide an independent high-precision positioning system so European political and military authorities do not have to rely on the US GPS, or the Russian GLONASS systems, which could be disabled or degraded by their operators at any time. The European Geostationary Navigation Overlay Service is a satellite-based augmentation system developed by the ESA and Eurocontrol. Currently, it supplements the GPS by reporting on the reliability and accuracy of their positioning data and sending out corrections. The system will supplement Galileo in a future version. The Copernicus program is the EU's Earth observation program coordinated and managed by USPA in partnership with ESA. It aims at achieving a global, continuous, autonomous, high-quality, wide-range Earth observation capacity, providing accurate, timely and easily accessible information to, among other things, improve the management of the environment, understand and mitigate the effects of climate change, and ensure civil security. Agriculture and fisheries. The Common Agricultural Policy is the agricultural policy of the European Union. It implements a system of agricultural subsidies and other programs. It was introduced in 1962 and has since then undergone several changes to reduce the EEC budget cost and consider rural development in its aims. It has, however, been criticized on the grounds of its cost and its environmental and humanitarian effects. Likewise, the Common Fisheries Policy is the fisheries policy of the European Union. It sets quotas for which member states are allowed to catch each type of fish, as well as encouraging the fishing industry by various market interventions and fishing subsidies. It was introduced in 2009 with the Treaty of Lisbon, which formally enshrined fisheries conservation policy as one of the handful of exclusive competences reserved for the European Union. Regional development. The 5 European structural and investment funds are supporting the development of the EU regions, primarily the underdeveloped ones, located mostly in the states of Central and Southern Europe. Another fund provides support for candidate members to transform their country to conform to the EU standard. Demographic transition to a society of aging population, low fertility rates, and depopulation of non-metropolitan regions is tackled within this policies. Labor. The free movement of persons means that EU citizens can move freely between member states to live, work, study or retire in another country. This required the lowering of administrative formalities and recognition of professional qualifications of other states. The EU seasonally adjusted unemployment rate was 6.7% in September 2018. The euro area unemployment rate was 8.1%. Among the member states, the lowest unemployment rates were recorded in the Czech Republic, Germany, and Poland, and the highest in Spain and Greece/Ref. Freedom, security, and justice. Since the creation of the European Union in 1993, it has developed its competencies in the area of justice and home affairs, initially at an intergovernmental level and later by supranationalism. Accordingly, the Union has legislated in areas such as extradition, family law, asylum law, and criminal justice. The EU has also established agencies to coordinate police, prosecution and civil litigations across the member states, Europol for police cooperation, CEPOL for training of police forces and the Eurojust for cooperation between prosecutors and courts. It also operates the Eucharis database of vehicles and drivers, the Eurodake, the European Criminal Records Information System, the European Cyber Crime Centre, FADU, PRADO, and others. Prohibitions against discrimination have a long standing in the treaties. In more recent years, these have been supplemented by powers to legislate against discrimination based on race, religion, disability, age, and sexual orientation. The treaties declare that the European Union itself is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities, in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity and equality between women and men prevail. By virtue of these powers, the EU has enacted legislation on sexism in the workplace, age discrimination, and racial discrimination. In 2009, the Lisbon Treaty gave legal effect to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. The Charter is a codified catalogue of fundamental rights against which the EU's legal acts can be judged. It consolidates many rights which were previously recognized by the Court of Justice and derived from the constitutional traditions common to the member states. The Court of Justice has long recognized fundamental rights and has, on occasion, invalidated EU legislation based on its failure to adhere to those fundamental rights. Signing the European Convention on Human Rights is a condition for EU membership. Previously, the EU itself could not accede to the Convention as it is neither a state nor had the competence to accede. The Lisbon Treaty and Protocol 14 to the ECHR have changed this. The former binds the EU to accede to the Convention while the latter formally permits it. The EU is independent from the Council of Europe, although they share purpose and ideas, especially on the rule of law, human rights, and democracy. Furthermore, the European Convention on Human Rights and European Social Charter, as well as the source of law for the Charter of Fundamental Rights, are created by the Council of Europe. The EU has also promoted human rights issues in the wider world. The EU opposes the death penalty and has proposed its worldwide abolition. Abolition of the death penalty is a condition for EU membership. On October 19, 2020, the European Union revealed new plans to create a legal structure to act against human rights violations worldwide. The new plan was expected to provide the European Union with greater flexibility to target and sanction those responsible for serious human rights violations and abuses around the world. Foreign relations. Foreign policy cooperation between member states dates from the establishment of the Community in 1957, when member states negotiated as a bloc in international trade negotiations under the EU's Common Commercial Policy. Steps for a more wide-ranging coordination in foreign relations began in 1970 with the establishment of European Political Cooperation, which created an informal consultation process between member states with the aim of forming common foreign policies. In 1987, the European Political Cooperation was introduced on a formal basis by the Single European Act. EPC was renamed as the Common Foreign and Security Policy by the Maastricht Treaty. The aims of the CFSP are to promote both the EU's own interests and those of the international community as a whole, including the furtherance of international cooperation, respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The CFSP requires unanimity among the member states on the appropriate policy to follow on any particular issue. The unanimity and difficult issues treated under the CFSP sometimes lead to disagreements, such as those which occurred over the war in Iraq. The coordinator and representative of the CFSP within the EU is the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, who speaks on behalf of the EU in foreign policy and defense matters, and has the task of articulating the positions expressed by the member states on these fields of policy into a common alignment. The High Representative heads up the European External Action Service, a unique EU department that has been officially implemented and operational since December 1, 2010 on the occasion of the first anniversary of the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon. The EEAS will serve as a foreign ministry and diplomatic corps for the European Union. Besides the emerging international policy of the European Union, the international influence of the EU is also felt through enlargement. The perceived benefits of becoming a member of the EU act as an incentive for both political and economic reform in states wishing to fulfill the EU's accession criteria, and are considered an important factor contributing to the reform of European formerly communist countries. 762 This influence on the internal affairs of other countries is generally referred to as soft power, as opposed to military hard power. Humanitarian aid. The European Commission's Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection Department, or ECHO, provides humanitarian aid from the EU to developing countries. In 2012, its budget amounted to €874 million, 51% of the budget went to Africa and 20% to Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Pacific, and 20% to the Middle East and Mediterranean. Humanitarian aid is financed directly by the budget as part of the financial instruments for external action and also by the European Development Fund. The EU's external action financing is divided into geographic instruments and thematic instruments. The geographic instruments provide aid through the Development Cooperation Instrument, which must spend 95% of its budget on official development assistance, and from the European Neighbourhood and Partnership Instrument, which contains some relevant programs. The European Development Fund is made up of voluntary contributions by member states, but there is pressure to merge the EDF into the budget-financed instruments to encourage increased contributions to match the 0.7% target and allow the European Parliament greater oversight. In 2016, the average among EU countries was 0.4% and 5 had met or exceeded the 0.7% target: Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. If considered collectively, EU member states are the largest contributor of foreign aid in the world. International cooperation and development partnerships. The European Union uses foreign relations instruments like the European Neighbourhood Policy, which seeks to tie those countries to the east and south of the European territory of the EU to the Union. These countries, primarily developing countries, include some who seek to one day become either a member state of the European Union, or more closely integrated with the European Union. The EU offers financial assistance to countries within the European neighbourhood, so long as they meet the strict conditions of government reform, economic reform, and other issues surrounding positive transformation. This process is normally underpinned by an action plan, as agreed by both Brussels and the target country. There is also the worldwide European Union Global Strategy. International recognition of sustainable development as a key element is growing steadily. Its role was recognized in 3 major UN summits on sustainable development: the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development Indiana, Johannesburg, South Africa, and the 2012 UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro. Other key global agreements are the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The SDGs recognize that all countries must stimulate action in the following key areas: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership in order to tackle the global challenges that are crucial for the survival of humanity. EU development action is based on the European Consensus on Development, which was endorsed on December 20, 2005 by EU member states, the Council, the European Parliament and the Commission. It is applied from the principles of capability approach and rights-based approach to development. Funding is provided by the Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance and the Global Europe programs. Partnership and cooperation agreements are bilateral agreements with non-member nations. Sustainability, territorial and social cohesion. The European Union has long sought to mitigate the effects of free markets by protecting workers' rights and preventing social and environmental dumping. To this end it has adopted laws establishing minimum employment and environmental standards. These included the Working Time Directive and the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. Social rights and equality. The EU has also sought to coordinate the social security and health systems of member states to facilitate individuals exercising free movement rights and to ensure they maintain their ability to access social security and health services in other member states. Social security main legislation is found in the Equal Treatment in Occupational Social Security Directive 86/378. The Equal Treatment in Social Security Directive 79/7/EEC, the Social Security Regulation 1408/71/EC and 883/2004/EC and the Directive 2005/36/EC. The European Directive about Minimum Wage, which looks to lift minimum wages and strengthen collective bargaining, was approved by the European Parliament in September 2022 SINCE 2019. There has been a European Commissioner for Equality and the European Institute for Gender Equality has existed since 2007. A directive on countering gender-based violence has been proposed. In September 2022, a European care strategy was approved in order to provide quality, affordable and accessible care services. In 2020, the first ever European Union strategy on LGBTQ equality was approved under Helena Dalli mandate. In December 2021, the Commission announced the intention of codifying a union-wide law against LGBT hate crimes. The European Social Charter is the main body that recognizes the social rights of European citizens. Housing, youth, childhood, functional diversity, or elderly care are supportive competencies of the European Union and can be financed by the European Social Fund. The European Pillar of Social Rights contains a preamble and 3 chapters with target values for 20 fields. Chapter I, Equal Opportunities and Access to the Labor Market. Chapter 2, Fair Working Conditions. Chapter 3, Social Protection and Inclusion. The EPSR is intended to act as a reference document of sorts, by means of which the labor markets and social standards in the member states may approach the standards defined in the pillar in the long term. Demographics. On January 1, 2021, the population of the EU was about 447 million people. In 2015, 5.1 million children were born in the EU 28, corresponding to a birth rate of 10 per 1,000, which is 8 births below the world average. For comparison, the EU 28 birth rate had stood at 10.6 in 2000, 12.8 in 1985 and 16.3 in 1970. Its population growth rate was positive at an estimated 0.23% in 2016. In 2010, 47.3 million people who lived in the EU were born outside their resident country. This corresponds to 9.4% of the total EU population. Of these, 31.4 million were born outside the EU and 16.0 million were born in another EU member state. The largest absolute numbers of people born outside the EU were in Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands. In 2017, approximately 825,000 people acquired citizenship of a member state of the EU. The largest groups were nationals of Morocco, Albania, India, Turkey, and Pakistan. 2.4 million immigrants from non-EU countries entered the EU in 2017. Urbanization. The EU's population is highly urbanized. Some 75% of inhabitants lived in Indiana urban areas in 2006. Cities are largely spread out across the EU with a large grouping in and around the Benelux. The EU contains about 40 urban areas with populations of over 1 million. With a population of over 13 million, Paris is the largest metropolitan area and the only megacity in the EU. Paris is followed by Madrid, Barcelona, Berlin, the Ruhr, Milan, and Rome, all with a metropolitan population of over 4 million. The EU also has numerous polycentric urbanist regions like Rhine-Ruhr, Randstad, Frankfurt-Rhine-Main, the Flemish Diamond and Upper Silesian area. Languages. The EU has 24 official languages: Bulgarian, Croatian, Czech, Danish, Dutch, English, Estonian, Finnish, French, German, Greek, Hungarian, Italian, Irish, Latvian, Lithuanian, Maltese, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Slovak, Slovene, Spanish, and Swedish. Important documents, such as legislation, are translated into every official language, and the European Parliament provides translation for documents and plenary sessions. In 2020, the EU stated that translation and interpreting costs were less than 1% of its annual budget of €148 billion. Due to the high number of official languages, most of the institutions use only a handful of working languages. The European Commission conducts its internal business in 3 procedural languages: English, French, and German. Similarly, the Court of Justice of the European Union uses French as the working language, while the European Central Bank conducts its business primarily in English. Even though language policy is the responsibility of member states, EU institutions promote multilingualism among its citizens. In 2012, English was the most widely spoken language in the EU, being understood by 51% of the EU population when counting both native and non-native speakers. However, following the UK's exit from the bloc in early 2020, the percentage of the EU population who spoke English as their native language fell from 13% to 1%. German is the most widely spoken mother tongue, and the second most widely understood foreign language, followed by French. In addition, both are official languages of several EU member states. More than half of EU citizens are able to engage in a conversation in a language other than their mother tongue. A total of 20 official languages of the EU belong to the Indo-European language family, represented by the Balto-Slavic, the Italic, the Germanic, the Hellenic, and the Celtic branches. Only 4 languages, namely Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian, and Maltese, are not Indo-European languages. The 3 official alphabets of the EU all derive from the archaic Greek scripts. Luxembourgish and Turkish are the only 2 national languages that are not official languages of the EU. On February 26, 2016, it was made public that Cyprus has asked to make Turkish an official EU language, in a gesture that could help solve the division of the country. Besides the 24 official languages, there are about 150 regional and minority languages, spoken by up to 50 million people. Catalan, Galician and Basque are not recognized official languages of the EU but have official status in one member state. Therefore, official translations of the treaties are made into them, and citizens have the right to correspond with the institutions in these languages. The European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, ratified by most EU states, provides general guidelines that states can follow to protect their linguistic heritage. The European Day of Languages is held annually on September 26 and is aimed at encouraging language learning across Europe. Religion. The EU has no formal connection to any religion. Article 17 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union recognizes the status under national law of churches and religious associations as well as that of philosophical and non-confessional organizations. The preamble to the Treaty on European Union mentions the cultural, religious, and humanist inheritance of Europe. Discussion over the draft texts of the European Constitution and later the Treaty of Lisbon included proposals to mention Christianity or a god, or both, in the preamble of the text, but the idea faced opposition and was dropped. Christians in the EU are divided among members of Catholicism, numerous Protestant denominations, and the Eastern Orthodox Church. In 2009, the EU had an estimated Muslim population of 13 million, and an estimated Jewish population of over 1 million. The other world religions of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sikhism are also represented in the EU population. According to new polls about religiosity in the EU in 2015 by Eurobarometer, Christianity is the largest religion in the EU, accounting for 71.6% of the EU population. Catholics are the largest Christian group, accounting for 45.3% of the EU population, while Protestants make up 11.1%, Eastern Orthodox make up 9.6%, and other Christians make up 5.6%. Eurostat's Eurobarometer opinion polls showed in 2005 that 52% of EU citizens believed Indiana a god, 27% are in some sort of spirit or life force, and 18% had no form of belief. Many countries have experienced falling church attendance and membership in recent years. The countries where the fewest people reported a religious belief were Estonia and the Czech Republic. The most religious countries were Malta as well as Cyprus and Romania, each with about 90% of citizens professing a belief in God. Across the EU, belief was higher among women, older people, those with religious upbringing, those who left school at 15 or 16, and those positioning themselves on the right of the political scale. Education and research. Basic education is an area where the EU's role is limited to supporting national governments. In higher education, the policy was developed in the 1980s in programs supporting exchanges and mobility. The most visible of these has been the Erasmus program, a university exchange program which began in 1987. In its first 20 years, it supported international exchange opportunities for well over 1.5 million university and college students and became a symbol of European student life. There are similar programs for school pupils and teachers, for trainees in vocational education and training, and for adult learners in the Lifelong Learning Program 2007-2013. These programs are designed to encourage a wider knowledge of other countries and to spread good practices in the education and training fields across the EU. Through its support of the Bologna process, the EU is supporting comparable standards and compatible degrees across Europe. Scientific development is facilitated through the EU's framework programs, the first of which started in 1984. The aims of EU policy in this area are to coordinate and stimulate research. The Independent European Research Council allocates EU funds to European or national research projects. EU research and technological framework programs deal in a number of areas, for example energy, where the aim is to develop a diverse mix of renewable energy to help the environment and to reduce dependence on imported fuels. Health. The Article 35 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union affirms that a high level of human health protection shall be ensured in the definition and implementation of all Union policies and activities. The European Commission's Directorate General for Health and Consumers seeks to align national laws on the protection of people's health, on the consumers' rights, on the safety of food and other products. All EU and many other European countries offer their citizens a free European health insurance card which, on a reciprocal basis, provides insurance for emergency medical treatment insurance when visiting other participating European countries. A directive on cross-border healthcare aims at promoting cooperation on healthcare between member states and facilitating access to safe and high-quality cross-border healthcare for European patients. The EU has some of the highest levels of life expectancy in the world, with Spain, Italy, Sweden, France, Malta, Ireland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Greece all among the world's top 20 countries with the highest life expectancy. In general, life expectancy is lower in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. In 2018, the EU region with the highest life expectancy was Madrid, Spain at 85.2 years, followed by the Spanish regions of La Rioja and Castilla y León both at 84.3 years. Trentino in Italy at 84.3 years and Île-de-France in France at 84.2 years. The overall life expectancy in the EU in 2018 was 81.0 years, higher than the world average of 72.6 years. Culture. Cultural cooperation between member states has been an interest of the European Union since its inclusion as a community competency in the Maastricht Treaty. Actions taken in the cultural area by the EU include the Culture 2007 year programme, the European Cultural Month event, and orchestras such as the European Union Youth Orchestra. The European Capital of Culture programme selects one or more cities in every year to assist the cultural development of that city. Sport. Sport is mainly the responsibility of the member states or other international organizations, rather than of the EU. There are some EU policies that have affected sport, such as the free movement of workers, which was at the core of the Bosman ruling that prohibited national football leagues from imposing quotas on foreign players with EU member state citizenship. The Treaty of Lisbon requires any application of economic rules to take into account the specific nature of sport and its structures based on voluntary activity. This followed lobbying by governing organizations such as the International Olympic Committee and FIFA, due to objections over the application of free market principles to sport, which led to an increasing gap between rich and poor clubs. The EU does fund a program for Israeli, Jordanian, Irish, and British football coaches, as part of the Football for Peace project. Symbols. The flag of Europe consists of a circle of 12 golden stars on a blue background. Originally designed in 1955 for the Council of Europe, the flag was adopted by the European Communities, the predecessors of the present European Union, in 1986. The Council of Europe gave the flag a symbolic description in the following terms, though the official symbolic description adopted by the EU omits the reference to the Western world. Against the blue sky of the Western world, the stars symbolize the peoples of Europe in a form of a circle, the sign of union. The number of stars is invariably 12, the figure 12 being the symbol of perfection and entirety. United in Diversity was adopted as the motto of the Union in 2000, having been selected from proposals submitted by school pupils. Since 1985, the Flag Day of the Union has been Europe Day, on May 9. The anthem of the EU is an instrumental version of the prelude to the Ode to Joy, the fourth movement of Ludwig van Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The anthem was adopted by European community leaders in 1985 and has since been played on official occasions. Besides naming the continent, the Greek mythological figure of Europa has frequently been employed as a personification of Europe. Known from the myth in which Zeus seduces her in the guise of a white bull, Europa has also been referred to in relation to the present Union. Statues of Europa and the bull decorate several of the EU's institutions, and a portrait of her is seen on the 2013 series of Euro banknotes. The bull is, for its part, depicted on all residence permit cards. Charles the Great, also known as Charlemagne and later recognized as Pater Europae, has a symbolic relevance to Europe. The Commission has named one of its central buildings in Brussels after Charlemagne, and the city of Aachen has since 1949 awarded the Charlemagne Prize to champions of European unification. Since 2008, the organizers of this prize, in conjunction with the European Parliament, have awarded the Charlemagne Youth Prize in recognition of similar efforts led by young people. Media. Media freedom is a fundamental right that applies to all member states of the European Union and its citizens, as defined in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights as well as the European Convention on Human Rights, one within the EU enlargement process. Guaranteeing media freedom is named a key indicator of a country's readiness to become part of the EU. The majority of media in the European Union are national-orientated, although some EU-wide media focusing on European affairs have emerged. Since the early 1990s, such as Euronews, Eurosport, EU Observer, Euractiv, or Politico Europe. Arte is a public Franco-German TV network that promotes programming in the areas of culture and the arts. 80% of its programming are provided in equal proportion by the two member companies, while the remainder is being provided by the European Economic Interest Grouping Arte GEIE and the channel's European partners. The media program of the European Union has supported the European popular film and audiovisual industries since 1991. It provides support for the development, promotion, and distribution of European works within Europe and beyond. Influence. The European Union has had a significant positive economic effect on most member states. According to a 2019 study of the member states who joined from 1973 to 2004, without European integration, per capita incomes would have been, on average, approximately 10% or lower. Indiana the first 10 years after joining the EU. Greece was the exception reported by the study, which analyzed up to 2008, to avoid confounding effects from the global financial crisis. A 2021 study in the Journal of Political Economy found that the 2004 enlargement had aggregate beneficial economic effects on all groups in both the old and new member states. The largest winners were the new member states, in particular unskilled labor in the new member states. The European Union has contributed to peace in Europe, in particular by pacifying border disputes, and to the spread of democracy, especially by encouraging democratic reforms in aspiring Eastern European member states after the collapse of the USSR. Scholar Thomas Riss wrote in 2009, "There is a consensus in the literature on Eastern Europe that the EU membership perspective had a huge anchoring effects for the new democracies." However, R. Daniel Kellerman argues that the EU has proved beneficial to leaders who are overseeing democratic backsliding, as the EU is reluctant to intervene in domestic politics, gives authoritarian governments funds which they can use to strengthen their regimes, and because freedom of movement within the EU allows dissenting citizens to leave their backsliding countries. At the same time, the Union provides an external constraint that prevents soft authoritarian regimes from progressing into hard dictatorships. See also: Outline of the European Union, Special Member State Territories and the European Union, List of country groupings, List of multilateral free trade agreements, Euroscepticism, Pan-European nationalism, Brexit withdrawal agreement, European Union United Kingdom Free Trade Agreement, African Union. Notes. References.